Have you ever been told you feel too deeply, ask too many questions, or care too much? And when they said it, did you shrink a little? Did a part of you wonder, what's wrong with me? Why can't I just be easier, lighter, quieter? Many women carry the invisible scars of being labeled too much, too emotional, too intense, too sensitive. These aren't just words, they are judgments, often whispered by those who are emotionally unprepared to witness the fullness of a woman. And over time they become internalized as truths, silent rules, invisible cages. You start to edit yourself, to speak less, to need less, to love less, until one day you barely recognize the vibrant, expressive woman you once were. But here's the truth, you were never too much. They were simply too limited. In a culture that still rewards female silence and self-containment, emotional depth in a woman is often seen as threatening. Passion is misread as instability. Vulnerability is mistaken for weakness. And honesty, especially emotional honesty, is often met with discomfort or mockery. But emotional intensity is not a flaw. It is a sign of attunement, of awareness, of a nervous system that has felt and survived. A woman who cries easily, speaks openly, or feels deeply is often not broken. She's awake. She's connected to something many have long numbed or buried, the truth of their inner world. And yet from a young age, most women are trained to become palatable. We're taught that to be loved, we must be liked. To be liked, we must be manageable. And to be manageable, we must suppress anything that might make others uncomfortable. Especially men, especially emotionally avoidant ones. So what do? We begin to amputate pieces of ourselves in exchange for approval. We become smaller than our pain, less visible than our brilliance, quieter than our longing. We contort ourselves to fit within someone else's emotional range and call that compatibility, but the cost is high. You don't just lose parts of yourself, you lose the right to be yourself. Skinner once said that behavior is shaped and maintained by its consequences. If your emotional openness was consistently met with silence, withdrawal, or ridicule, you likely learned to suppress it, not because it was wrong, but because it wasn't reinforced. You were conditioned to believe your emotions were dangerous, that love meant self-abandonment, that connection required contraction. But what if that learning was based on a flawed environment? What if you weren't too much, but rather surrounded by those who were too emotionally stunted to offer genuine connection? I once knew a woman named Helena. She was bold, emotionally articulate, and deeply affectionate. Her heart was an open invitation. But every partner she chose seemed threatened by her clarity. They'd say things like, "You take everything so seriously," or "Why do you always need to talk about feelings?" Over time, Helena began to dim herself. She stopped initiating conversations. She questioned her instincts. She labeled herself needy. The truth? She wasn't needy. She was just repeatedly paired with men who were emotionally unequipped. Men who had been taught to escape depth, to flinch from feeling, to mistake emotional numbness for strength. From a behavioral perspective, Helena was simply adapting. In an environment that punished emotional expressiveness, she learned to inhibit it, not because she lacked value, but because the feedback loop told her she was too much. But she wasn't. She was just right. And so are you. This isn't about blaming. It's about naming. Naming the systems, the conditioning, the emotional neglect that trained you to shrink your voice. Because once you name a pattern, you can change it. You can stop measuring your emotional world through someone else's limitations. So let me ask you gently, have you been shrinking to make someone else more comfortable? Have you mistaken their emotional absence for your emotional excess? What if your emotions are not a problem to be solved, but a truth to be honored? What if the very things you were told to hide are your greatest sources of connection, intuition, and vitality? As Skinner might say, behavior does not exist in a vacuum. It's always shaped by environment. And when the environment is emotionally impoverished, even healthy behavior begins to feel wrong. So here is your symbolic task for today. Write down 3 moments when you felt too much. Then ask yourself, was I truly too much? Or was I just too real for someone who wasn't ready? And then write this sentence somewhere you'll see it often. I wasn't too much. I was just in the wrong room. Because a woman who feels deeply isn't broken. She's awake. And awakening is rarely quiet. Understanding emotional unavailability. Have you ever loved someone who always kept you at arm's length, close enough to hope, but never close enough to rest? You waited for them to open up, to tell you what they feel, to meet you where you are. But instead, you got silence. Vague promises. Shallow conversations that circled everything except the truth. And over time, you began to wonder, is it me? Am I asking for too much? Am I too intense, too emotional, too something? Let's pause right there. Emotional unavailability is not your fault, but it does become your pattern if you keep mistaking emotional distance for mystery, or worse, for safety. Emotionally unavailable people often show up as charming, intelligent, even attentive at first. But the moment intimacy deepens, they withdraw. They change the subject. They say, "You're overthinking it," or they simply vanish emotionally, leaving you stuck in a confusing loop of self-blame and longing. In behavioral terms, this is intermittent reinforcement, the most powerful form of conditioning. Skinner observed that when a behavior, like reaching for emotional connection, is only occasionally rewarded with moments of affection, intimacy, or clarity, it becomes very hard to extinguish. You don't give up, you try harder. You become hyper-vigilant. You analyze every text, every word, every pause, because when someone gives you breadcrumbs, your hunger grows. And in that hunger, you lose sight of your needs. You confuse inconsistency with depth. You start to call it passion, but it's not passion. It's deprivation, dressed up as desire. Why does someone become emotionally unavailable? Often it starts in childhood. A boy grows up in a home where feelings are inconvenient. He learns that vulnerability invites rejection, or worse, ridicule. He learns to shut down before he gets hurt. Over time, he becomes a man who fears the very intimacy he craves. He wants connection, but not the discomfort of honesty. He longs for closeness, but not the surrender it requires. So he keeps women at a distance, sometimes through avoidance, sometimes through control, but always through inconsistency. And yet, women like you keep showing up, open-hearted, emotionally available, willing to do the emotional labor of two people, willing to wait, willing to shrink, willing to love someone who cannot love back in the way you need. Why? Because you've been conditioned to believe that if you're patient enough, kind enough, forgiving enough, he'll eventually change, that your love will heal him, that his silence means he's thinking, not avoiding, that his absence means confusion, not detachment. But here's the bitter truth wrapped in compassion. His inability to connect is not a reflection of your worth. It is a reflection of his limitations. Let's remember, you are not the therapist of the relationship. You are not the fixer. You are not responsible for dragging a man into his own heart. Skinner would point out that behaviors, especially evasive ones, persist when they work. If you continue to stay, to soothe, to excuse, then his avoidance is reinforced. You're not demanding change, you're adapting to dysfunction. And the longer you stay in that dance, the more you internalize his absence as your failure. But it's not your failure. I want to share the story of Lucia. She spent 10 years in a relationship with a man who was never quite there. He loved her, he said, but he couldn't talk about emotions. He deflected everything with humor. When she cried, he'd disappear for days. When she asked for clarity, he'd accuse her of being dramatic. And for a decade, Lucia believed if I could just explain better, stay calmer, be more understanding, he'll finally meet me where I am. But he never did. She wasn't asking for too much. She was asking the wrong person. And that's the most dangerous part of emotional unavailability. It makes you question your sanity. It makes you forget that love is not supposed to feel like confusion or emotional starvation or chronic anxiety. Love is supposed to feel like safety. So ask yourself, are you staying hopeful in a place that only reinforces your doubt? Are you confusing your ability to endure pain with the presence of love? You deserve reciprocity, not just emotional labor, not just emotional potential. Real connection, real vulnerability. A partner who knows how to sit in discomfort without running away. Someone who has done the work, not just fantasized about it. So here is your symbolic task. Write this down and speak it aloud if you can. I release the fantasy that someone emotionally unavailable will become my emotional home. Then ask yourself, What would it feel like to be loved by someone who doesn't need to be rescued from himself? Emotional availability is not a luxury. It is a minimum requirement for intimacy. And no, you're not asking for too much. You're asking the wrong person to give what they never learned to hold: the impact of emotional neglect. What if the deepest wounds aren't the ones that were caused by what was done to you, but by what wasn't? No screaming, no betrayal, no obvious cruelty, just absence, silence, indifference, a hand that never reached for yours, a voice that didn't ask how you were, a face that turned away when you most needed to be seen. Emotional neglect is invisible, but its consequences are not. It teaches a woman that her feelings are unimportant, that her needs are excessive, that love is something she must earn by asking for less. And over time, this becomes her norm. You see, emotional neglect rarely makes headlines. It's not as dramatic as abuse. It doesn't leave physical marks, but it leaves something else, a quiet erosion of the self. When the people around you consistently ignore, minimize, or avoid your emotional needs, you begin to internalize a dangerous belief. My emotions are a burden. From a behavioral perspective, this is a kind of punishment by omission. When a child expresses sadness and is ignored, or worse, subtly mocked, she learns to disconnect from her emotional experience, not because she wants to, but because it's safer that way. The environment teaches her: do not feel, do not ask, do not need. And what is reinforced? Emotional numbness, self-reliance taken to the extreme, a compulsive ability to be fine even when everything inside is unraveling. But a girl who learned to suppress her needs becomes a woman who overfunctions in silence. She becomes the caretaker, the fixer, the one who anticipates everyone else's emotions but cannot articulate her own. She doesn't ask for help. She proves she doesn't need it. She doesn't cry. She rationalizes. She doesn't express anger. She swallows it. And here's the painful irony: this woman is often praised. She's so strong, they say, so independent, so low maintenance. But they don't see the loneliness beneath the competence, the ache beneath the control. I want to tell you about Marta. She was married for 18 years to a man who never yelled at her, never cheated, never raised a hand. But he also never asked how she felt, never noticed when she withdrew, never comforted her when she cried softly in the dark. When she finally left, people were confused. But he was such a good husband, they said. What they didn't see was the emotional starvation, the years of unmet needs, the slow dying of her voice, the loneliness of sharing a bed with someone who treated her feelings like a foreign language. Emotional neglect is cruel in its invisibility. It offers just enough presence to keep you from leaving, but never enough intimacy to let you fully arrive. Skinner would explain this in terms of extinction. If a behavior, like expressing a need, is never reinforced, it eventually disappears. Marta had learned that her emotions didn't matter, so she stopped expressing them. Not because she lacked them, but because the environment had taught her they were useless. Are you starting to see the pattern? This isn't about dramatizing your past. It's about validating your pain. Because many women carry guilt for suffering in relationships that looked fine on the outside. They ask, "Who am I to complain? He never hurt me." But absence is a form of harm. A partner who withholds presence, empathy, or emotional responsiveness is not neutral. He is shaping your experience. And often, that experience is isolation. So ask yourself, have you learned to deny your own needs just to preserve the appearance of peace? Have you mistaken emotional silence for stability because it's what you were taught to expect? Healing from emotional neglect is not about becoming louder. It's about becoming more honest with yourself, with your history, with your nervous system, which may still flinch at the idea of being emotionally seen. Here is your symbolic task. Write a letter, not to your partner, not to your parent, but to the version of yourself who learned to suppress her feelings. Tell her, "I see now what you were protecting me from, but I won't keep silencing you to make others comfortable." Let that younger self speak, cry, rage, express, because the silence that protected you then might be the very thing suffocating you now. Emotional neglect may not be loud, but its echoes last for decades. And yet, awareness changes everything. When you start to validate your own emotional experience, you begin the slow, radical process of becoming emotionally alive again. And a woman who comes back to her feelings is a woman who cannot be controlled. Reclaiming your emotional power. What happens when a woman who spent her life being quiet finally says no more? Not with shouting, not with violence, but with a calm, grounded certainty that echoes louder than any scream. She stops apologizing for her feelings. She stops explaining herself to people who aren't listening. She stops performing emotional labor for those who refuse to carry even their share. That's the moment she begins to reclaim her emotional power. But make no mistake, this doesn't happen overnight. It happens quietly, often after years of depletion, after one too many dinners filled with tension and fake smiles, after being told one too many times to relax, to stop being so sensitive, to not make a big deal out of it, until one day, something inside her shifts. She doesn't just feel tired, she feels done. Done with carrying the weight of the relationship, done with feeling unseen, done with mistaking survival for love. From a behavioral lens, we call this extinction, followed by renewal. A response that was once reinforced, being quiet, pleasing, enduring, stops yielding connection. So the woman experiments. She sets a boundary, she walks away, she changes the contingency. And suddenly a new behavior emerges, self-protection. Boundaries are not a rejection of others, they are a profound return to the self. But most women were never taught to see it that way. We were taught to be accommodating, agreeable, empathetic to the point of erasure. Setting limits felt like selfishness, saying no felt like abandonment, as if our only value was in being endlessly available. But the truth is this: when you say no, your body learns what respect feels like. Boundaries are how you teach others and yourself what is sacred. They don't have to be loud. They can be as simple as, "I'm not available for that conversation right now. I need a moment to reflect before I respond." This dynamic no longer feels healthy to me. Some people won't like it, especially those who benefited from your silence. But emotional power isn't about being liked. It's about being aligned with your truth, your needs, your limits. And it doesn't stop with boundaries. Reclaiming your emotional power also means reparenting yourself with compassion, because if you've gone decades without validation, your nervous system may not recognize it as safe. You may feel guilty for resting, ashamed for crying, resistant to receiving love that asks nothing of you. That's not weakness, that's conditioning. You were trained to believe love must be earned, that your worth was in your usefulness, that to need was to burden. But those are not truths. They're survival strategies. You can learn a new way. And here's where self-validation becomes a radical act. Try saying to yourself, "I'm allowed to feel this. My emotions are valid even if no one else understands them. I don't have to justify my boundaries to anyone." When you begin to offer yourself the empathy you always craved from others, something profound happens. You stop begging, you stop chasing, you start choosing. And then your circle changes. You stop tolerating emotional crumbs. You seek people who can sit with complexity, who don't flinch when you're vulnerable, who don't punish you for expressing a full range of emotion. These people may be fewer, but they are real. And the relationships you build with them will not require performance. They will allow for rest, for rage, for softness, for truth. You don't need a crowd, you need resonance. Skinner taught that the environment shapes behavior, but when the environment is toxic, the most powerful act is to change the environment. Create conditions that support your emotional flourishing. That's not selfish, that's science. You cannot heal in spaces that continually reinforce your erasure. So here is your symbolic task. Make a list of 3 behaviors you've tolerated in others that harm your emotional well-being. Then, write next to each one, "I no longer make space for this." And after that, write this, "I honor the voice I silenced to survive." Because now she's not just surviving, she's reclaiming. The woman you're becoming knows her worth, not because someone handed it to her, but because she returned to herself and remembered. Embracing your authentic self. What if you stopped asking, "How can I be less?" and started asking, "What have I been hiding to be loved?" There comes a moment in every woman's life when the mask becomes too heavy, the smile feels fake, the pretending too exhausting, and beneath it all there's a quiet voice, one that's been whispering for years. There's more to me than this performance. To embrace your authentic self is not an act of rebellion. It's an act of remembrance. You're not becoming someone new. You're peeling back the layers of conditioning, fear, and shame to return to who you've always been, before the world told you who to be. For many women, this return feels like betrayal. Betrayal of the roles we were taught to play. The good daughter, the quiet wife, the peacemaker, the understanding partner. We were shaped to be pleasant, manageable, predictable. But real women, whole women, are not manageable. They feel deeply, speak boldly, change their minds, say no even when it's inconvenient, and perhaps most dangerously, they stop needing permission to exist fully. From a behavioral standpoint, the authentic self is often punished in early environments. A child who expresses strong emotions may be scolded. A teenager who asserts independence may be called defiant. Over time, behaviors that reflect authenticity become suppressed, not because they're wrong, but because they weren't reinforced. So, what gets reinforced instead? Compliance, emotional detachment, agreeableness, and we call that maturity. But it's not maturity, it's self-abandonment in disguise. Carl Jung called it the persona, the mask we wear to survive in society. But masks, even beautiful ones, become prisons. They keep you safe and suffocated. So the question becomes, are you still editing yourself to be loved? And if so, what is the cost of that love? I want to tell you about Anna. After a divorce in her late 50s, she realized something heartbreaking. She had no idea who she was without the roles she had played. For years, she had shaped herself around her husband's moods, her children's needs, her family's expectations. And when the house was finally quiet, she wasn't free. She was empty. But that emptiness was sacred, because it wasn't a void, it was space. Space to ask, what do I want? What do I love? What does my voice sound like when I'm not editing it? And slowly, Anna began to remember. She started painting again, started saying no without guilt, started taking herself to dinner, and most importantly, she stopped apologizing for her intensity. Because here's the truth, your emotional intensity is not a flaw. It's a form of wisdom. It means you feel, you notice, you care, you're alive. A culture that's addicted to superficiality will always label depth as too much. But you were never meant to live on the surface. You were meant to dive. And the women who dive? They find truth, and peace, and a kind of joy that doesn't depend on someone else's comfort. Skinner reminds us that freedom is not the absence of influence, but the awareness of it. You can't escape your conditioning, but you can see it, name it, and choose differently. So here is your symbolic task. Stand in front of the mirror. Look at yourself, not to judge, but to witness, and say aloud, I do not exist to be palatable. I exist to be real. Then write this down and carry it with you. The woman I'm becoming doesn't ask for approval. She lives in her truth. Because embracing your authentic self isn't about being loud or wild or visible to others. It's about being visible to yourself. Finally, without shame. You are not difficult. You just stopped settling for less. You are not too much. You are finally enough for yourself. And that is power. If this touched something inside you, leave a comment sharing what you've been told was too much about you. Register to keep receiving content that honors your emotional depth and your behavioral truth. Because the woman you're becoming, she doesn't accept crumbs, she bakes her own freedom.